the reins over to Dr. Burrell.
So what I'll do is I'll get started and we'll wait for when my other colleagues log on. Um, I'm Dr. Darrell Burrell. My other colleagues, Dr. Terrence, Duncan, and Dr. Emad, Rahim are part of the group. And so just to give you a little bit of insight, I teach for University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I also teach for Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia. I'm in the School of Public Health at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then I'm in the School of Business at Marymount University. I try to tell people that my path through academia is not linear or direct. It's very non-traditional. I was not a great student as an undergrad, and I struggled a lot to get to where I was to finish my bachelor's degree, and then ended up falling in love with learning because I had a professor that made me fall in love with learning. So as an end result, I try to be that person in the classroom. Just to give you a little insight in terms of things I teach. So previously, before I worked in academia, I worked for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and I did a lot of diversity and inclusion work. One of the interesting things about my career is I got a Global Peacemaker Fellowship from Claremont Lincoln University, where I studied diversity and inclusion in the workplace based on religion. And so I kind of fell into it in that I had a colleague of mine that worked at the Department of Homeland Security, and he basically shared that if my colleagues found out I was Muslim, it would sabotage his career. And so systematically, he was going to work every day, like trying to hide an important part about him, which was his faith. And so as an end result, I became curious, and I found this grant and researched like how to look at religious intolerance in the workplace. And one of the things that surprised me was we train people on race and ethnicity and sexual orientation and things around that, but we never train people on diverse religions. And so I got the fellowship and started doing research and really started thinking about how, religion influences people's interaction in the workplace. And then because I taught in healthcare and public health, I really wanted to think about how, religion and religious intolerance interacts with people when they're being treated in a healthcare environment. And so as an end result of my research and experience, I worked on a series of projects related to research, and then kind of used the things that I was seeing in my research to inform how I teach in the classroom. And so to give you a particular example, someone's asking.
Just taking care of some housekeeping business.
Yeah. So one of the things that I turned the captions on, so thank you for reminding me. So one of the things that influenced my research in terms of how I was interacting in the classroom was I wanted to take some of the assignments and include assignments where people would have to do something related to diversity and inclusion as an assignment. So a classic example is I taught a human resources management class in healthcare, and as their final case study, all of the case studies had to do something around diversity and inclusion. So typical example is you're a medical school and medical center. You need to recruit more African-American male doctors, go out and do research and figure that out. Or you're a hospital and you've had a series of religious discrimination complaints in your nursing staff. Your team is a consultant, figure that out. Or you're a medical group and systematically you've had a variety of sexual harassment complaints around female doctors, kind of explore that. And so one of the ways that I've been able to incorporate equity and diversity and inclusion in the classroom is by creating assignments that allow students to explore these topics within the confines of the classroom. I've done the same thing in my business classes. I've done the same thing in my management classes. So when you're coming up with case studies and examples, I try to use some current events, things around diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and try to turn those into case studies that students can explore and can use to explore these kind of concepts in the class. Another example of some of the things that I've done is, so previously to before I worked in academia, we did a diversity inclusion book club series. So some of you are including diversity inclusion in the classroom, but some of you all might be doing diversity inclusion training and work in your organizations. And so a lot of times when you're doing the work, it's challenging in terms of where to start, how to navigate it. And so one of the things that I found has been successful is, book clubs that do training around diversity and inclusion based on book clubs. And so a classic example is we put together a series of books. And if you know anything about teaching people about equity and things around diversity, it's not a thing where you can have a workshop for 3 hours and people get it. It's really a thing where you have to embed it in a variety of areas and a variety of touch points so that people can leverage it and utilize it and use it. And so we put together a series of books. Along with the books, we had people do journals and journal prompts. And then we had a larger group of students that were in the class, but then we put them in smaller groups where they met with their smaller groups. So the larger group met once a month and debriefed on the book. The smaller groups met twice a month as kind of accountability partners over the book. And so one of the books we used was Heather McGee, The Sum of Us. So if you're not familiar with that book, her book, and I saw her speak at the Path Foundation in Virginia, her book really talks about how racism doesn't just hurt the people that the racism against, it hurts everyone. And she uses some historical examples that talked about in certain places in the South, there were public pools, and instead of integrating the pools, they closed the pools up. So what she talked about was because people didn't want people of color swimming in the pools, then no one could benefit from the pools. And so reading that book kind of provided people a context to really look at why equity issues are important, even if they don't infringe on you or your lifestyle, or even if they don't touch you, to kind of challenge you to think differently about them or to think deeper about them in terms of what the impact can be. And then the other book we had there's a book called Everyone's a Hypocrite. It's the idea of a modular mind. The whole concept of the book is how we are able to rationalize our thinking, even when some of our thinking might be totally ridiculous and off base, how we rationalize it and how we're kind of hypocritical in some of the ways that we approach thinking and things around ideas. And then one of the other books we used was, Howard Ross, Everyday Bias. And then we used a book, his name is Abu Patel. He does a book on, religious pluralism on a variety of levels. And one of the reasons why I felt that that book is powerful to use as a tool to teach people is he tells a story about Keith Ellison. And if people are not familiar, Keith Ellison is the first Muslim American elected to Congress. And so when he wanted to get sworn in, he wanted to be sworn in using the Quran. And so one of the things when he wanted to do that was there were a whole bunch of senators that were in uproar that did not want him to use the Quran in the Capitol and wanted him to be sworn in by the Bible. But the fascinating thing that that Mr. Patel tells about it was the Quran he wanted to be used was Thomas Jefferson's Quran. And what he was trying to get people to understand was when Thomas Jefferson tried to write the Declaration of Independence, he used a variety of religious texts from all over the globe to try to create this framework for how people interact with each other. And so someone asked, will the books be provided? I'll try to get a list of the books so that you all can look at them. So thanks for asking that question. And so one of the key things about using the book club as an idea is people read the books on their own. You have prompts around them, but people read and digest the books on their own, and then they meet with their small groups to have discussions in their small groups. And then a larger group, we debrief the book. And the reason why I say to use, 6 or as many as 12 books is over time, the different books inform each other. And I think over time, you kind of change people's paradigms based on their ability to read the books and have discussions with people around the context of those books. And so, and it's a low cost thing that you can do from a training and development standpoint, but I've also incorporated kind of book club assignments within my text in the class. So to give you an example, I'm teaching a class that deals with, equity and diversity and humility in the workplace. And so one of the things that I've done is I've used a series of books where the students have to do an analysis of the book that they turn in individually, but they're also working in groups to share their perspectives about the book. And then I'm giving them a case study at the end where I'm requiring them to use concepts and theories from the book in their final case study. And one of the neat things about that particular class is instead of just using static discussion board questions, I've been using TED Talks as the weekly prompts. So there's a whole bunch of beautiful TED Talks out there. One of my favorite one is Dr. Anthony Jack, where he talks about diversity is not inclusion. I use clips from Renee Myers, who talks about diversity is being asked to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And her whole premise is just because you're inviting people there, you have to create an inclusive environment for them to feel welcome. And so what I find that the TED Talks, using TED Talks in the discussion boards are able to do is create an environment where people can look at a video and hear a different voice than my own and can discuss it with their classmates. And then one of the requirements with my discussion board assignments is don't regurgitate back like a book report, like what you saw. Tell me the implications of what you saw. Tell me how it impacts the field. Tell me how it might impact you as a professional. Tell me how it might impact an organizational leader. And then I challenge them to use a concept or term from one of the course texts or course readings that apply to what you saw in the video and use that as part of your post. And so the whole premise around it is, okay, we're going to give you theoretical, you're learning things in the book. We're going to engage you in discussions. You're learning to YouTube. You're looking at YouTube with some of the cutting edge things that I talk about related to research and scholarship. And then at the end, you're using a case study where you're starting to apply a lot of the things that you learn throughout the class, right, to inform your teaching or your teaching practice. Does anyone have any questions about that? Or any thoughts about that? So to give you an example, one of the things that I did in my class, in dealing with diversity and humility and equity, it's a leadership class, was so we had a face-to-face session originally to start, and then the rest of it was online on Zoom. And so one of the things that I did was I used a workshop framework that another colleague of mine, Dr. Quorum Haseen, kind of introduced me to. And so one of the things that I did was I put people in groups and I asked them to, groups of 2, and I asked them to talk to their partner and tell the story about how their partner, their family got your name. So I call it the name story. So all of us have a story about how our parents picked out our name for us. And so you're supposed to tell your partner, and the whole premise after you tell your partner is your partner is supposed to introduce you to the larger group by telling the story of your name. And so I always go first. I always tell people that my parents thought I was going to be a girl. They had picked out the name Lisa. And there were all these wives' tales like, if you're craving something sweet, you're going to have a girl. Or, you know, if the baby's high, you're going to have a girl, all these wives' tales. And then I was born and I was a boy. And so my dad quickly wanted to come up with what he felt was a strong male name that was unique. So he came out with Darrell, Burrell. So he came out with that name. And so I share that. And so what happens is in the class, each person shares the story of the person's name and how they got their name. And so when you go through the class with everyone going and introducing their partner, when we get to the end, I try to explain to them what I observed. And what I explained to them was that each person took so much care and concern with how they introduced each person and shared their name. And they were checking with the person to say, am I saying this right? Am I doing this right? To just verify that they were doing it properly. And so I asked anyone else, did they observe that? And one of the person said, yeah, I wanted to make sure, I wanted to show care and, you know, respect to the story because it's a unique story. And so we got the end. One of the things I wanted to show them was the same care that you took and care that you took with understanding and sharing the person's name is the same. If we could step outside of each other and show that same care and concern with people that are different from us, our engagement would be different. The analogy I wanted them to understand is each of us have different names and each of us have different stories to our different names. And I said, the problem is sometimes when we interact with each other, we don't show the same reverence to someone's background or their story. But if we could think about the care and concern that we took when we shared each other's name, then that's really how we engage each other from a framework of equity inclusion. So I'm a big advocate of experiential learning. So the follow-up thing I did to that was I used colored paper clips and I gave each person in the group a paper clip. And I basically told them to, on their own individually with a piece of paper, come up with as many creative uses for the paper clip as you can. And so, you know, most people could come up with 7 to 10. Then I put them in groups of 4 or 5. Groups of 4 or 5 could come up with 25, like eliminating duplicates. And then we put the whole class together, and the whole class together came up with 85. And so what I wanted to explain to them was, on your own, you only came up with 10 or 12. When you partnered with a larger group, diverse group, you came up with 25. When you partner with a collective group, you came up with 85. And so I said, what if we decided to take all those contributions of the 85 and remove the African Americans, the Asian American contributions, the contributions from women, those numbers go down. I said, this is an example of how diverse perspectives pooled together, right, create innovation. On your own or in your small homogeneous group, you could only come out with a certain amount. But it wasn't until you got together with a larger group of people with diverse perspectives and minds that you were able to come up with a larger amount of contributions and people. And so I explained to people that here's your evidence, right? If someone's challenged you, does diversity and inclusion spur innovation? So if you were to take that same exercise and look at people in the workplace, what if all of a sudden we had women there, but we didn't include their perspectives or their contributions, right? What would that look like? And not only would that look like we wouldn't get their contributions, but how would that make them feel if in an environment we just purposely didn't include them or we ignored their contributions? And so examples like these are some examples that I've used in the classroom to try to explain. And you could do something like this on Zoom too, but what these things represent is ways of how you can kind of get people from an experiential learning standpoint to understand the importance of equity, importance of inclusion, or you can incorporate this based on the topics you're teaching in the classroom, you know, different perspectives. Does anyone have any questions for me at this point? Or comments or thoughts?
This is all gold. Keep going.
So, you know, one of the things, assignments I've done, and thank you for the compliment, I really appreciate it. So one of the assignments I've done in the class is I've asked students, so a powerful thing for me was when I finished my, let me step back. So when I talk about case studies, what I try to do is final case studies is I try to create case studies that hit on a variety of issues. So in my class I taught in leadership, one of the things that I talked about is, you know, some dynamics about LGBT people when it comes to healthcare and the healthcare environment. One of the other examples I had was invisible disabilities in the workplace. And so one of the things that some Harvard researchers came out and said that in a given workplace, 35% of your workers have some level of invisible disabilities. So it could be ADHD, could be dyslexia, it could be anxiety, it could be depression. And what they said was a lot of organizations, people don't self-disclose out of fear or shame, or organisms don't have mechanisms to really support people. And so one of the things that we discussed in the case study was, you know, what do you think are the best practices to be able to support people with invisible disabilities? I had one with employees that were deaf and hard of hearing. You know, I gave the example of sexual harassment, religious intolerance in the workplace. And so those are some of the case studies that I've used at the end. So if you're teaching management or if you're teaching sociology or teaching psychology, you can use simple case studies like this as a final project. I have them do it in teams. And one of the things that I do by having them do it in teams is I have them pretend like they're a consultant where they have to explain what's going on, but I challenge them to use theories from the literature in their final paper and presentation. And so one of the things is, for those of you all that are in psychology, you know, there's certain fields or theories from psychology. So I give them a list as breadcrumbs, but they don't have to stay in that list. And so one of the things I tell them is, in order for your case or your presentation to be complete, you need to do at least 2 leadership theories, 2 kind of developmental theories, right? And maybe 2 change management theories. Because one of the things that I want them to think about is not only do you just swoop in and do things, but these theories can give you kind of a foundation or guardrails or a structure on how you problem solve in organizations or how you look at the context of what we're teaching in the course. So if you're teaching a sociology course, you know, there's some sociology theories that you might want to use. So I give them theories as a breadcrumb, but I tell them they don't have to use those theories, but I give them theories to research and find out about. And so one of the reasons why those theories actually become a literature review. So the first part of the present of their paper is really explaining what's happening and what do they think is the dynamics of what's happening. And so in those theories, I don't want them to say, well, human relations theory applies to this. Don't just tell me human relations theory applies. Explain to me the elements of human relations theory that would apply to the dynamics. That's what's happening in this organization. And then as they look at those dynamics, right, and think about those dynamics, each one of those elements of the theory kind of applies. So One I used was a change management theory, was Cotter has 8 steps in the change management theory. So if you were coming in as a consultant and you're trying to move from the current state to a desired state, what would you do based on this diversity and equity issue, right? And you think of each one of the 8 steps in the Cotter theory, you know, how would each one of these steps apply to how you're trying to move the needle? And then I challenge them to go out in the literature and find recommendations on how to solve it, either through the literature or either interviewing people that are experts on the subject. So they have either or. They can go in the literature and find, or maybe they might find someone who's over diversity and equity at a college and university and interview 3 or 5 people and say, if this was happening, what would you do about this, or how would you address this? And then at the end, they make the recommendation. So what I don't tell them during the class while they're working on the paper, and what I allow them to do is, before their final paper and presentation, I allow them to submit a draft for credit. And the reason why I want them to submit a draft is I want to give the team feedback before their final paper. And so they submit a draft, I give them feedback. So in the final class, they present their presentation to a larger class. And the reason why I have them present to the larger class is, you know, a lot of times you'll have assignments and people will turn it in and you'll give them a grade, but I also feel like people can learn from each other based on another team's strategy. So one of the reasons why I have them do presentations at the end is so, you know, the other team, 2 teams might pick the same topic, but approach it totally different. So they can kind of learn from each other. But so what I did not tell them at the end is, there's a well-respected publisher in Hershey, Pennsylvania called IGI Publishing. IGI Publishing publishes journals, but they also publish peer-reviewed books. So this year was the first year I reached out to them to do an interdisciplinary book on a variety of fields to be the editor on it. And what I wanted to do was use it as an outlet for some of my students to take papers and assignments, not just for my class, but maybe some things they've done in other classes, and allow them an opportunity to take that paper and get it published. And so when students did their presentations at the end, you know, I allowed all those students in teams to be able to take their paper and submit it to the peer review book. And each chapter has a DOI, it's indexed in Google Scholar, Scopus, Web of Science, to have a publication possibly at the end. It was not a requirement of the course. I made it optional, but it allowed them to publish together, because one of the things that I wanted that to do was to give them, you know, an artifact beyond grades and transcripts. So when they're interviewing with someone, or maybe they're applying to grad school, or maybe they're applying to a PhD program, they have something concrete that they can show. This is a team project I worked on related to this, that they can use as an artifact to tell about their ability to solve problems, work in teams, manage projects, and be kind of innovative around that. And so to me, it's been kind of a nice journey. And by me being the editor, I get to pick the reviewers to make reviewers are kind. So those of you all that know, we submit papers through the publishing process. It's not always friendly. It's not always kind. So one of the things that I try to do is create an environment where people can get constructive feedback. And I always tell my reviewers, right, do the best you can to give them feedback so their article can be published, not rejected, you know. And by me giving them a chance to do the draft, and by me giving them feedback in my class, I have a good idea of where they need to go with their paper, where they have a higher propensity to get their paper accepted. And so when it goes to the reviewers, right, usually what I found so far with my students this semester is it's been minor revisions, or it's been publishable as it is. Does anyone have any questions about that or that process? Yeah, so IGI is a global publisher. For any of you all that are teaching classes, you can submit a proposal to them for a book. And, you know, one of the things is there's no publishing charges or APC charges on it. And, you know, you can be the editor, you can assign the reviewers, but since it's worked so well this year, it's something that I'm going to do on an annual basis for my students to have them an outlet. Yeah, the publisher is IGI. I'm going to try to get it and put it in the chat. Give me a second. Yeah, I just put it in the chat. So if you go to their site, you can see books published with us, these other things. So there's a thing when you look at the bottom, I think where it is. When they talk about on the top, they have a publish with us, and you click on that link and it could say submit a book chapter, or propose a journal, or submit an article, or propose a book proposal. So I would just say the book proposal is what I use, because last year they switched that a lot of their journals, because they're open access, they're charging, you know, APC charges for them. So I just use the journals. I use the books. And so I just included a link to, like, if you had an idea. And one of the things that I think is nice is if you have a bunch of colleagues. So what's been beautiful is not just allow the students to publish, but all of us have academic colleagues that, you know, have ideas and concepts that they want to leverage, that touch on a lot of areas that may be experiential or may be unique. One of the challenges when you start to think about teaching and learning around diversity and equity is there are some journals that may not understand your voice, or might have reviewers that don't really understand what you're talking about. And so it's always nice where you can put information out there that might look at things from a different lens than what's previously being done. One of the problems that I see out here in like that peer review space, if you're taking things that you're doing in the classroom and trying to share them with others, is a lot of these journals have very narrow views of what they think is credible scholarship. And so when you start to think about equity inclusion, it isn't just what we teach in the class, but it also can include, you know, how our scholarship is perceived or how we disseminate our information. And me being a non-traditional student, not getting my bachelor's till I was 30 years of age, finding out 3 years ago I had undiagnosed learning disabilities, right? And finding out a little dynamics around me being different, I've had challenges like being in academia, navigating that space and finding a space where I fit in. And so because I had my own challenges, I've tried to find spaces for other people. So to give you an example, the Journal of Applied Psychology had a special issue on COVID. And one of the things that fascinated me was when COVID first started, I live in a predominantly white area. And I never forget that when people were wearing a mask, I was reluctant as a Black man to wear a mask in a bank. I just felt funny about it. And growing up in certain environments, my dad always taught me, carry yourself a certain way, dress a certain way, because people might perceive you one way or another. And I said, is it just me being paranoid or is it something else? And so I started to contact some of my other African-American male friends, and they felt the same. One told me when he went in the parking garage, someone was afraid because he was walking behind him in the mask, or security guard at the place. So I wanted to write an article that really talked about how the need for psychological safety in the workplace and how there was a dichotomy. If I wear a mask, right, I could be profiled or I could be at risk, or if I don't wear a mask, I could be at risk. Well, I wrote this up. I put all kind of theory, stereotype, threat theory, looking glass self theory, and sent it to the journal. And the woman was like, the journal editor was like, oh, desk reject. Oh, I don't see how this is related to a special issue on COVID. Or I sent it to another journal and they said, well, it's biased. It's overly biased. Yeah, it's overly biased because it's not the lens that you look in the world. So it literally took me 18 months before I got it published, but I'm very, very proud of it. Like, another example of some diverse research I've done that's under review right now at the journal is so one of my things on the bucket list is I want to go fly fishing. I want to learn fly fishing. I've been one time, I want to go this summer. So I went to a fly fishing expo at a private school near where I live. And I saw these group of women with pink hats on at this booth, and I wanted to talk to them because the pink hat reminded me of breast cancer awareness. My mom's a breast cancer survivor. So I went, and they have this organization called Casting for Recovery. And the whole premise of it is they take women that are breast cancer survivors and they do fly fishing together. So they go out in nature and they talk with each other, and it's a support group, and they're out with nature and it's mindfulness, and they learn about fly fishing. So their sense of community is, instead of them sitting in some room, right, around a circle sharing, they're out in nature. And so I was like, wow, this would be really cool to turn into a journal article to put out there. So I went and researched theories on stress and cancer diagnosis and the dynamics around that. And I basically turned that into an article that I sent to a journal. But I use all this as an example to try to explain to you that when it comes to diversity of scholarship, diversity of teaching, diversity of learning, there's a variety of ways that you can touch it and hit on it, but it's all about being creative, right? Getting outside the box and looking at things differently, or bringing a voice to a topic in a way that maybe hasn't been done before, right? You don't have to teach a class that's directly related to diversity and inclusion to bring concepts like the paperclip exercise. You could use that as an icebreaker, right? Or the name exercise. You can use that as an icebreaker to really allow people to touch on things on diversity and inclusion. So the final thing I'll share, because my time is almost up, is so one of the exercises I did in the class was I actually had students go out and interview someone of a diverse background in them. And we had a series of questions and prompts. And this kind of struck me because as an undergrad, I had to do that in an assignment in a class. And I interviewed one of my friend's wife who was from South Africa, and she was Jewish. And so I wanted to ask her questions because I grew up in an environment with apartheid, thinking, from a lens that all white people from South Africa just hated Black people. And she just told the story of how she grew up and she had friends who were Black and she just didn't like apartheid and she wasn't for it, but her experiences were so different. So a lot of my assumptions I had that all white people from South Africa didn't like Black people a certain way were totally wrong. And I shattered those paradigms by interviewing someone that was different. So you can bring these kind of assignments in the classroom to kind of challenge people to get outside their comfort zone. And if you write the right prompts and questions, right, it can be a dynamic learning experience for them that's a lot more comprehensive than a midterm or a final exam. Does anyone have any questions before I conclude?
We are actually out of time, and I hate that the time has gone so fast and that we had to start late, but your presentation has been so amazing. I know you had to do this without your colleagues, and I hope that they are okay in spite of the power outages. So thank you for stepping up and just doing an amazing job, sharing your stories and your ideas. I am so motivated. So thank you so much, Dr. Burrell. And
yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. Like if you look at, if you type Dr. Darrell Burrell on LinkedIn, anyone can connect with me. I have an IGI book right now. If any of you all have any things that you want to do about teaching and learning in the classroom that you're doing, I would be more than apt to accept a paper for you and try to help you get it published in my book. So if any of you all want to reach out to me, by all means, like a lot of you are doing innovative things in the classroom and we can use those things. And if you want to reach out to me, I'll work with you on some ideas on maybe how to publish it in a book. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your resources, for your energy, for what you have brought to this presentation. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you've been inspired as I have, and I just hope you have a wonderful rest of the day and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure and an honor. Take care.
Dr. Burrell. Oh, he left. Are you still there?
Yes.
Yes.
he's here.
Let's stop the recording real quick.